You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We talk a lot about Anzacs. We talk a lot about the POWs in the Second World War. Well, we read a lot about them. We see a lot about them. And in fact, this show has actually talked about POWs in the First World War on the Western Front. But we don't talk about the experience of their captivity. We don't talk about the Mediterranean theatre. And we haven't heard much about what it's like to be captured by Ottomans. And I don't mean an army of footstools. G'day listeners, and welcome back to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, and I would like to thank you for a change rather than thank myself for all your support you've provided us. The iTunes reviews are great. They could be greater in terms of volume, but we're pretty happy with the amount of stars you've been giving us lately. Also, those people have been coming on board with the Patreon Legends program. Thanks very much. Just so you know, if you do subscribe to our Patreon account and sling us some of your tin, you will get exclusive content, updates, and early access, like the early access we provided with our interview with Sir Hugh Strawn. And what an answer to that bonus question it was. Now, I talked before about Ottomans, the Turkish variety, not the footstool variety, and POWs, and Anzac. Now, Anzac is a way to get a hit episode out there. I just need to say Anzac in the description, and I know I'll get 1,000 downloads. So let's talk about something that you don't generally talk about with Anzac, and let's see if we can get some more discussion happening about the experience of those people who were captured by the Ottomans, the experience of those Anzacs. I can't tell you about it though, because I don't know anything about it. And as usual, with my 50% record on reading my guests' books before they come on the show, you can guess which one I am for today. But my guest today has read the book because she wrote the book. She knows all about it. Dr Kate Ariotti is a lecturer at the University of Newcastle and a historian of war and Australian society. Prior to joining the University of Newcastle in 2015, she worked as a historian in the military history section at the Australian War Memorial. That's the place where they let me in the door, you guys know that. She has written multiple journal articles and book chapters, and in 2017 co-edited with Dr. James Bennett. He hasn't come on the show yet, maybe we can give his contact details after this. Australians and the First World War, Local Global Connections in Context. That was published by Palgrave. She published Captive Anzacs, Australian POWs of the Ottomans during the First World War. Americans note it doesn't say World War I. With Cambridge University Press in 2018. Kate, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mick. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, before we start talking about footstools and prisoners and the experience of captives, I'm really keen to know how you found yourself studying, one, military history, First World War history, Anzac history, and then, Anzacs and Ottomans, captives and capteurs. See, it took me a while to think of that. That's why I am the host and not the guest. So what made you want to become a historian?
So that's a really good question. And the very short answer is I didn't always want to be a historian. In fact, I didn't actually know that you could be a historian. Let me elaborate on that a little bit. So I've always loved history. I was actually born in the north of England, and spent some of my early years there. And I distinctly remember going to places like Whitby. I don't know if you or your readers are familiar with it, but it's famous for being the place
whaler.
Where Dracula...
The Whitby whaler.
Well, yes, the whaler, but also where Dracula supposedly washed up on shore.
Yeah.
But it's also very famous for having a beautiful old abbey on the very top of the hill, and a churchyard that's kind of associated, a church and a churchyard that's associated with that. And I have very early memories of wandering around that church and that abbey and those gravestones, which sounds a bit grim and macabre, but it's actually a very beautiful place. And looking at these headstones, and some of them were from the 1500s, the 1600s, and I was just fascinated by it. But I actually grew up in Queensland. And like a lot of young girls in Queensland, I dead set wanted to be a marine biologist. We did a family trip to the Great Barrier Reef, and that was it. I wanted to swim with the fish. play with dolphins, etc., etc., etc. So I continued to study history at school, but I actually went to uni to do a science degree. And in the last year of my science degree, I was doing a subject called Parasites and Human Health.
Oh, wonderful.
And yes, one of the assignments we had to do was look at parasites in human history. And coincidentally, my mum had just finished reading a book about prisoners of war on the Burma-Thai Railway. It was actually Rolly Richards' book called A Doctor's War. So Rolly Richards was a POW doctor.
Yep.
And she gave it to me to read, and I was absolutely hooked. I thought, this is fantastic. I can do this assignment on, you know, how the prisoners of war dealt with all the horrible nasties they had to deal with on the Burma-Thai Railway. And it just absolutely, the more I kind of read about it, the more I got into it, the more I realised that's what I want to do. I want to read about all this really exciting, interesting stuff, and I want to write about it. And it was actually one of my science lecturers who said to me, that's the historian. So, very roundabout kind of story. But I think more broadly, I've always really, really been interested in how people over time have kind of reacted to really challenging situations or coped with really challenging situations, unprecedented situations.
Yeah.
And of course, through human history, you know, war is one of the big kind of challenging, unprecedented situations that people have had to deal with. So that's what I'm really, really interested in, kind of unearthing those, I guess, coping strategies.
Well, so listeners, we've got someone who likes to walk around graveyards thinking about parasites. So I'm just going to end the interview here. This is not what I expected. No, I'm just kidding. But I have never had a guest say that either graveyards or parasites on the human body got them into history, which is excellent because this show's all about broadening the conversation, and it probably can't get broader in terms of military history. Now let's talk about your book. So you caught our eye when you released your book recently, and one because it had Anzac in the title, and as we know, that's an attention magnet for anything, even terrible marketing campaigns by supermarket chains. But what really got our attention is the fact that it was about POWs again, and it was about POWs we, as a team, didn't know anything about, and me particularly. So, you know, as I said, I've talked about POWs on the Western Front before. Everyone knows about, you talk about the Burma Railway, the Australian prisoners in Southeast Asia and the Japanese. Pretty famous story back home here in Australia. If you've heard about World War II or the Second World War, then you've heard about that. But not too many people have heard about prisoners of the Ottomans in the Mediterranean theatre in the First World War, unless they've seen The Water Diviner, which amazing movie. No spoilers.
Don't go there.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write a book on this particular topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, I've always been really interested in how people have kind of dealt with unprecedented, kind of challenging, difficult situations. And I've always also been really interested in histories of captivity, because that, of course, is a prime example, as I said earlier, of a difficult, challenging, unprecedented situation. And so when I was doing my honours thesis project, which was about prisoners of the Japanese and how they'd kind of, kind of thinking about those popular ideas of them as being quite powerless and almost kind of passive in a way, that they kind of were taken prisoner, they were put into camps, they were made to work, and if they were lucky, they survived. Yeah. So my honours thesis was really trying to tease out, well, how did they survive? Because, you know, everybody focuses on the fact that 8,000 of them died, and rightly so, because that's tragic. But I think, so my honours thesis was kind of reorienting that to think, well, how did 14,000 or so of them survive?
Yeah.
That extent. So when I was doing the research for that mini kind of project, I kept finding these little references and these little footnotes to POWs from the First World War.
Yeah.
And it really intrigued me at the time, but I didn't really kind of follow it up. And then when I started my PhD, I was kind of thinking about what it is I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something about captivity and POWs, but the prisoners of the Japanese is something that, as you said, a lot of people are already very familiar with, or at least aware of, and I wanted to do something really different. So I thought, I'm going to follow up some of these footnotes and realise that, yes, of course, Australians were taken prisoner by the Germans on the Western Front, but a small number of Australians were taken prisoner by the Ottomans during the Gallipoli campaign, the fighting in Sinai, Palestine, and in Mesopotamia, which is now obviously Iraq. So I really wanted to explore that further. But I think what really sold me on this particular project was because I actually, when I had got my list of men who'd been taken prisoner, I kind of just thought, well, how can I try and track some of these people down a bit more? How can I try and get in touch with their families? So I picked out some quite obscure surnames, having quite an obscure surname myself, and managed to find the daughter of one particular POW who lived, coincidentally, about 10 k's from the university where I was doing my PhD. Went and had a bit of a chat with her, and she had very fortuitously just donated 3.5 years worth of correspondence. Her father, as a prisoner of war in the Ottoman Empire, had written home to the State Library of Queensland. And I kind of got early access to those papers. And I just remember sitting in the reading room of the John Oxley Library, pouring through this like 3.5 years worth of letters, and just thinking to myself, this is an incredible story, and it's a history that has to be told. We need to know more about it, because it's a history that can tell us so much about Australia and Australians during the First World War, but also more broadly, as I said, those ideas of coping with a difficult situation. And also how an experience that on the surface only seemed to affect 200 men had these kind of ripple effects, these resonances that played out much more broadly than you would think. So basically it was a kind of a small group of men who I was able to get lots of information about, and then just kind of track how their experiences played out over time.
Wow. I mean, it seems like luck played a good part of your story as well, which is good, because
right place, right time.
Yeah, I mean, it's better than not having luck. So, that's a good thing. I'm sure there's someone out there who was trying to study something and it all went the other way. And, they don't get to come on the show. So you look at their difficulties. You talk about the difficulties, and you've talked about it here, faced by the captives during their imprisonment, and these extraordinary circumstances these people have managed to survive or deal with. Can you provide our listeners with some details on some of these difficulties that they went through in their imprisonment?
Yeah, of course. So I tried to approach it thinking about, what it was that they found, the prisoners themselves found particularly difficult or particularly challenging, and tried to kind of classify them loosely. So the first kind of category were the physical difficulties of their captivity. So I think it's, we need to remember that the Ottoman Empire, when it went to war in 1914, had been at war in the Balkans for many years previously. Was very, in comparison to other kind of Western nations or states or even empires at the time, it was very underdeveloped. It was still very much tied to like an agricultural economy. It had even, it was dealing with ethnic tension and kind of attacks from outside and within. And it actually had earned itself the reputation or the nickname of the sick man of Europe. So in terms of the kind of facilities or infrastructure that was there to deal with POWs, it was always going to be challenging.
Yeah.
Now, if you overlay that with the sense of culture clash that captivity in the Ottoman Empire brought for these Australians and for the British and the French and indeed the Russians who were captured and held in prison camps alongside the Australians.
Yep.
Oh, and of course New Zealanders, we shouldn't forget the NZ in Anzac.
They won't let us forget.
But so this cultural clash was a real problem. And, you know, the Australians who went to war in 1914, you know, they'd grown up under the policies of white Australia.
Yeah.
They were very much of the opinion or the belief that white Britishers were racially and culturally superior. Yeah. And so when they were faced with life in the sick man of Europe, it was always going to be a problem. And coupled with that was that the provisions or the conventions for treating prisoners of war, the internationally kind of recognised conventions, the Hague Conventions, that were first kind of formalised in 1899 and then revised slightly in 1907. The key principle in those conventions relating to POWs was that if there wasn't a kind of an agreement in place beforehand, what was to happen was that any captor who took captives was to treat those captives on the same footing as troops of equivalent rank from the captor's army. Yeah. So basically, if you were an officer, an Australian officer, and you were captured by the Ottomans, you could expect the same kind of treatment that an Ottoman officer would get.
Yeah, it's fair enough.
If you were a private or, you know, a man from the ranks, you would expect the same kind of treatment that an Ottoman private would get, and that was not too crash hot at the time of the First World War.
So the officers were all right.
Sorry?
So the officers were all right, though?
The officers tended to have it much better because their rank conferred certain privileges.
Yep.
But for the men from the ranks, it was a pretty Spartan existence. And as I said, you know, so they're dealing with these kind of cultural clash issues about food, you know, what the Ottomans consider to be basic kind of rations is certainly not what Australians were used to. I mean, so the Australian POWs would get a plate of cracked wheat and olive oil, which I guess is kind of like hummus, tabbouleh, something similar to that. You know, what people in Australia now go out and pay huge amounts of money for to eat at restaurants.
That's right.
But for the POWs, they thought they were being served with animal food. They thought it was a way of humiliating them.
Yeah.
So there's like basic cultural issues going on there as well. There's religious issues because, of course, the majority of the Ottoman Turks were Islamic, were Muslims.
Yeah.
And overlay that with these problems, as I said, with infrastructure and accommodation and even moving prisoners from one camp to another was often done on foot or by cattle truck because there weren't enough trains or even train lines. There was problems with disease because the Ottoman Empire was very spread out and troops were moving all the time. There were problems with disease emanating from what was happening to the Armenians at the time. So you've got lots of Armenian displaced people and refugees. Not a lot of medical facilities available. So things like malaria, dysentery, typhus were spreading like wildfire through the POW, but also through the civilian population as well.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you've got these kind of what I call psychological difficulties, but at the time obviously weren't kind of phrased in that kind of language. But, you know, just the idea that you're a captive and you don't know how long you're going to be confined for. There's no end date to your confinement. It's just whenever the war ends, and who knows when that will be. So that's kind of playing on their minds. There's being cramped and being, you know, held in the same place or environment as the same people all the time, not getting a break or respite from each other. There's lack of privacy, there's missing family, there's all kinds of issues that are common in a lot of different POW situations as well. So really it's those physical difficulties that blended with the cultural clash, which fed into these psychological difficulties that made this an experience that was certainly trying for a lot of the POWs.
It's the cultural clash is something I suppose that most people don't necessarily think of straight away. And having spoken on this show with someone about the Western Front POWs, and the culture not too different, and also the way that officers were treated versus enlisted men seems to be standard, I guess. But the effect wasn't just on those who were imprisoned. There was an effect back home as well. So, back home in this case is my home as well. It's good to have an Australian guest on the show. So back here in Australia, there was families, society, a society that had a belief in its own martial prowess. Gallipoli kind of paid something else to that. So, how was it received at home, the imprisonment of, the Anzacs, and what sort of effect was there on the families and communities and, the national psyche back here in Australia?
Yeah. Well, again, this is an example of how these this minority experience has these much broader ripple effects.
Yeah.
And why I've always kind of ascribed to the idea that captivity is about much more than just what happens in the POW camp.
Yep.
So in the early years of the war, when the first POWs were taken during the Gallipoli campaign, and in Mesopotamia with the fall of the Kut El Amara garrison in April 1916, almost a year after the Gallipoli landings, there wasn't very much known about what was going on with them.
Yeah.
So obviously communication between the battlefront and the home front was slow. It depended on telegrams and letters being kind of put on steamships and sent home. Yeah. So there wasn't all that much known about them, and indeed the Australian government didn't really know how many men had been taken prisoner. They were still kind of scrabbling to try and figure that out by mid-1916. But certainly the families felt the implications of it.
Yeah.
And it's probably worth remembering here that, somewhere around 80% of the men who enlisted in the first AIF were unmarried. They were bachelors.
Okay.
So their next of kin were their parents or their siblings.
Yeah,
really.
Mums and dads and brothers.
Mums and dads, exactly. And, you can only really try and imagine, if you've never been in that situation yourself, how difficult it would be to send your son off to war and then hear that he's been in some kind of battle or whatever and he's been posted as missing.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows what's gone on. Yeah. Nobody can confirm if he was dead, if he was killed, or if he was wounded and in a hospital or whatever. And it's only really until they received a little postcard from their son themselves, who was captive, that they realised he'd been taken prisoner. So there's that really often quite long period of waiting to find out what had actually happened to their son or their brother or whatever, which would have been agonising.
Yeah.
And then it's a matter, for the families, it's a matter of trying to get as much information as they possibly can about what's going on and what it's like for their sons or their brothers or whatever. And really the only way they could do that was through communication with the prisoner themselves, which was very kind of sporadic and depended on whether or not mail was sent out of the POW camp that month or not, or through the new or relatively newly formed Australian Red Cross POW department. Mm-hmm. So that was set up in in London, in response to the kind of increasing number of Australians who were being taken prisoner on the Western Front in 1916 after Fromelles, primarily. And their remit was to basically try and make contact with Australian POWs wherever they may be, send them comforts parcels. So that could be extra rations, it could be clothing, it could be money, remittances of money, and also to keep their families abreast of what was happening. So I say in my book that the families of the POWs and the POW department formed what I called a network of, or a community of understanding, where basically they tried to communicate with each other as much as possible, and that meant families writing to the Red Cross and the Red Cross writing to families, but also the Red Cross putting family members of POWs in touch with each other. So, you know, the Red Cross might receive a letter from one POW that mentions another POW. So they will write to both parents and say, hey, this, you know, your son mentioned private blogs. Here's private, you know, I can put you in touch with Private Blogs' mother and you can share whatever information you can. So it's really this kind of grassroots network of people trying to get as much information as they possibly can about what's going on. So that's kind of the families, but on a broader kind of national scale, it was all about fundraising. So raising money particularly for the Red Cross, for the POW department, to assist with those kind of comforts parcels that they were sending. So, and it's really quite amazing because, you know, this is an Australian kind of home front that's being asked to give so much to so many different war-related causes. And yet people are still, for like the 4 years of the war, are still willing to donate money or goods or host fundraisers or button days, as they're often called sometimes, have sporting fixtures, you know, played out, that all the kind of money that was raised would go to the Red Cross POW department.
That's fascinating when you think about it, because I'm sure there are many guests, many listeners, although I do have many guests of the show as well, but many listeners, many guests, actually more guests than anyone else. But there are probably many listeners out there that wouldn't think of that when they think of the First World War and POWs. They wouldn't think of comfort packages, kind of what we send to troops now when they deploy, obviously not when they're prisoners, but you know, that's what people...
And they were really important for the POWs because, you know, and this was the case on the Western Front as well, sometimes the rations they were getting were just not enough to sustain them. And, you know, they're in captivity, but a lot of them are being used as a labour force as well, because that was permitted under the Hague Convention. So a lot of the Australian POWs were doing some pretty heavy manual labour on different kind of infrastructure projects in Anatolia, or what is now Turkey, and the big one being the Berlin to Baghdad railway. So there was a big stretch of that railway that passed through the Taurus Mountains region, which is a very mountainous region in kind of what is now the southeast-ish, I'm not very good with my geography, of modern Turkey.
Let's just say that's right.
Yeah, let's just say that's right. You can, you know, listeners can look it up online. And the rail line needed to be extended through there, and that meant, you know, blasting through mountains basically. So a lot of kind of pick and shovel work, track laying work, you know, really heavy labour on rations of boiled wheat and olive oil, sometimes a bit of meat if you're lucky. Often struggling with sickness. You know, as I said, malaria and typhus, dysentery were very common. So those comforts parcels really were more than just comforts parcels; they were a lifeline. Really,
it's also interesting. You know, the Baghdad to Berlin or Berlin to Baghdad railway. Everyone's heard of the Thai-Burma railway. But you know, it seems Australians have been building other people's railways for a while. Now, I consider myself slightly educated on the myths, legends, facts, figures of Anzac. I'll say slightly educated because I need to get smart people like you to talk to me to give me the details. But I've actually rarely read about these particular captives. Now, I just mentioned that that railway is a very good example of something that even has a catchy name that you could, Fitzsimmons or Ham could write a good book about, or they could write a book that sells about. I'll recant my statement of good book before previous guests jump on the show. But it seems like the sort of stuff that can be sensationalized. It hasn't. Why is that?
Well, I think there's a few factors going on there, Mick. I think, as you said earlier, Australians during the First World War and in the aftermath of the First World War, and indeed today, really pride themselves on a sense of martial prowess.
Yeah.
That idea of the quintessential Anzac being a soldier who doesn't give up, stays to course, never surrenders, that kind of thing. And, these men, whatever the circumstances had been, they had been taken captive.
Yeah.
There was a certain stigma associated with that. Had it been because of cowardice? Were they bad soldiers? I mean, when you look at the reasons why they were captured, there's a whole range of scenarios and problems that happened that led to their capture, ranging from, them being wounded in battle and kind of lying out in the equivalent of no man's land and being brought in by the enemy rather than their own bearers or whatever, to complete breakdowns in communication. There are instances of light horsemen in Palestine just not being told the order to withdraw. So they're kind of left out there wondering where everybody's gone, and all of a sudden they're surrounded by the enemy. There's confusion in the heat of battle. There's all kinds of things that happened. But at a broader kind of cultural level, there was a stigma associated with it. And indeed, one of the prisoners that I focused on quite a bit in the book, and indeed was the author of those letters that I was talking about earlier, and whose daughter I tracked down. The first letter he wrote to his parents after he was taken prisoner was, he basically said what had happened. He'd gone out to pass on a message. He'd got stuck between the lines. He'd actually been fired on by Australian machine gunners. This is on Gallipoli. And he jumped into a trench, into a kind of a shell hole, I guess, and pretty much just picked the wrong shell hole because it was full of Ottoman and German soldiers.
That is unfortunate.
Yeah, so the letter that he wrote back was, it's really quite difficult to read because he says, I know with the Australians it's a disgrace to be captured, and I've failed my country and I'm no longer a part of the war, and basically now it's my lot to just sit it out and wait. So they certainly felt a stigma about it. So that's one issue. I think the other issue as well is that when they kind of tried to write about their experiences, and some of them did publish memoirs or self-published memoirs or diaries that they'd kept or similar, the stories were not as exciting perhaps as the stories that guys who were fighting on the Western Front were coming back with. Because they're talking about industrial warfare, they're talking about flamethrowers, they're talking about beating back the Germans, they're talking about winning the war. Yeah. And the POWs, they can't tell that story. Their story is very different. Yeah. And then I think there's probably more recently, there is a sense of special relationship, special friendship, I guess, between Australians and Australian Turkey over Anzac and over Gallipoli in particular. And when POWs came home from the war, and indeed in the interwar years, and some of them were still writing about their experiences into the Second World War era, they were saying not very complimentary things about their captors. Yeah. Because, sometimes warranted, sometimes I think more of a reflection of that cultural clash that they were experiencing. Yeah. And it became a little bit awkward, to say the least.
Yeah, don't mention the war.
Kind of. And so I think for those three reasons and more that are in my book, and I'm not going to bore everybody with now, but their experiences really didn't kind of resonate with the broader First World War story or First World War narrative.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's both fascinating and kind of sad in a way. And just imagine what it could have done to counter toxic masculinity now if we had started to address some of these issues and ideas of what makes a good soldier back then. But I won't get on a soapbox tonight because we're recording this in the evening, ladies and gents. What I'm going to do, Kate, is go to the final question. Now, this is one all guests get to answer, and it relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, and continue that debate that we think is important on war and warfare and what it means to society. So I ask each guest to finish a sentence, and that sentence is war is. So right now, Kate, I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
Okay, this is a tricky one, isn't it? Okay, for me, war is much more than what happens on the battlefield. And war is something that different people experience very differently and can lead to a whole array of experiences, none of which are less important than others.
Well, that's a unique definition, a new definition, which is good because we've had 69 or 70 so of these definitions so far. And for those listeners out there, I will never offer one. Well, I might, but that's a good one. That's one we haven't had, so that's good. And it points to one of Big Carl's maxims about it being a human experience, a human interaction. So now we're going to switch to our bonus question, which half the listeners won't listen to. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for those listeners that are our Patreon supporters, I hope you enjoyed that answer for the bonus question. For those that you aren't, well, you just need to sling us some tin, jump on Patreon, check us out and support the show, and you'll get the bonus questions because, if you help us out, we'll help you out. Now, Kate, apart from that being an awesome definition and your book sounding really interesting, and I will read it at one stage. In fact, I'll send you a message when I do read it. So check your phone in about 10 years.
Yeah.
Captive Anzacs, Australian POWs of the Ottomans during the First World War, and that's by Cambridge University Press this year. Now, ladies and gents, as always, you can find that book in our show notes. We are still with Book Depository at the moment, but we'll probably be switching to another provider that may already own Book Depository. Kate, thank you very much for coming on the show.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me and for letting me talk about POWs for so long.
Not a problem, and I'm sure the listeners got an extra run on the treadmill for this episode. And listeners, you can also support Kate by following her on Twitter and seeing what she has to say. And she is at Kate_Ariotti. That last name is Ariotti. And until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.